Hello and welcome everyone to the podcast for day 35. In this podcast, we're going to talk about population ecology. And this is the first day that we're going to begin, the first day of our last unit, the unit on ecology. And we're going to start with the part of ecology that studies populations. The first podcast, we're going to cover the first two objectives of the note-taking guide. And then we'll have at least one more podcast covering the last three objectives. Let's begin with a simple definition of ecology. Ecology can be defined as the scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environment. We can think of the environment as being divided up into two components. So the environment, these are the abiotic factors plus the biotic factors. Biotic, as you might be able to guess, includes the living factors. These could be the animals in it could be the plants, anything that's alive. It can talk about the predator and the prey relationships. It can talk about parasites. It can talk about competition within the living organisms. Abiotic, the letter A, when we put that in front of a word, that means without. So this means the non-living factors. These are anything that influences the environment that is not alive. Things like sunlight, water, temperature, pH, lots of different things. The key is, though, it cannot be living. Okay, I'm going to erase this. Okay, next we want to talk about how we can break ecology down into four distinct fields. The first one is organismal. Ecology. The second one is population ecology. The third one is community ecology. And the last one would be ecosystems. To define these, let's think about some examples. An organismal ecologist would study single organisms and how they interact with the environment. So for instance, maybe a single whale. How does this whale feed? How does it survive? How does its lung capacity help it survive? Features that are specific to a single organism. A population ecologist might study a pod of whales. So a pod of whales would be a group of whales living together. So population ecology is a group of the same species plus the environment. Organismal ecology studies the whale. Population ecology studies a pod of whales, how the group of these whales interact with each other. And we're going to spend most of the rest of the day talking about this. Next week we'll talk about community ecology, but this would be more than one species plus the environment. So this might be that pod of whales, and let's just say we're talking about orcas, just to give us a reference here. We might say, now how do these orcas, this population of orcas, interact with other species in the ocean? Maybe seals. It would be a predator-prey relationship here. So that would be what a community ecologist might study. An ecosystems ecologist, they're going to be interested in how the community interacts with the environment plus the abiotic factors. So this would be taking our orcas plus all the biotic factors, so seals for instance, plus abiotic factors, so maybe water temperature, season, thinking about how the mating season, say, of the seals affects the predator-prey relationship of the orcas and the seals. Alright, so let's explore population ecology a little bit more. Remember, a population ecologist is going to study how a group of individuals of the same species interacts with the environment. Some important questions an ecologist, a population ecologist might address would be, how many individuals are in a population? Another question they might ask is, how are individuals distributed within a population? Another question is, how does population size change over time? So for the rest of this podcast, we're going to answer some of these questions. So this first question of how many individuals are in a population. Let's talk about that. There's two ways we can do this. One we would call a census. And in this method, what we would do is we would literally count every individual. If you're studying, say, a pod of whales, it might be easy to count the 10 to 20 individuals that are in that pod. But if you want to count the number of flamingos in southern Florida, that's going to be a little bit more difficult. Or the number of salamanders in a particular region in Michigan. This is going to be more difficult to do. So as an alternative to doing a census, you do sampling. And I think you did something like this in lab. And this is where you mark and recapture. And that's all you need to know about how the ecologist would answer this question of how many individuals are in a population. The next question is, how are individuals distributed within a population? So essentially what we're asking here is, what is the density of the population? And that's the number of individuals of a species per unit space. So number of individuals of a species per unit space. Another thing you might say is, why do we care? There's a lot of reasons we may care about this, but to give you an example of why we care is that as densities increases, so as the number of organisms of that species increases per unit space, competition for the resources also increases. So within that population of individuals, the larger it gets, there's less food available. There's less places for them to mate. There's less places for them to live. So all of these resources are also become limited. So I'm going to erase the bottom part here. And let's talk about 3 patterns of distribution. The first is called clumped. A few things about clumped is that it's the most common pattern of distribution. A clumped distribution results due to we'll call it patchy resources. And when I say patchy resources, what I mean is the resources, the food, the other habitat selections that these organisms need is not equally distributed within the environment. So there's food in one part of the environment. So it's to the organism's advantage to live in a clumped distribution. Or sometimes it's due to social interactions. I think sometimes the best example of this would be a school of fish. A school of fish function better in this group of a clumped distribution as they seek for food, for protection. Sometimes a big school of fish to a predator may appear as a much larger organism as opposed to many organisms together. Our second example is uniform. Let me first begin with an example. I think the best example I can think of, and I think your book may even mention it, if you've ever seen a picture or a video of penguins, you will notice that within the area that they're living in, that the penguins are fairly uniformly distributed as they maybe sit on their eggs. Meaning that the space between them is very similar. So our example would be penguins. And this usually results from territorially interactions. For instance, in our penguins here, they protect their individual territories. Okay, let's go ahead and erase this. And let's talk about our third distribution pattern. And this is random. An example, what we might see, and a good example of this are trees in a forest, in a rich forest, where you see certain trees kind of randomly distributed. You might see more in this area, fewer in this area, but they're usually fairly randomly distributed. This is usually due to the fact that, due to uniform resources. Meaning that the amount of water, the amount of nutrients in the soil, in this example of trees here, is uniform within this space. And so there's no competition for spaces. There's no need for interactions. In fact, we can say that random distribution, unlike the other two, is not influenced by interactions between individuals. Uniform is definitely influenced by the interactions between individuals as they are defending their territories. Clumped is definitely influenced by interactions between individuals as that school of fish work together to meet the common needs of the individuals. So these are the three patterns of distribution: clumped, uniform, and random. Now, as I was looking at your note-taking guide just now, I realized I didn't answer a question that I should have maybe answered before we got into this. And that is, what's the difference between density and dispersion? Well, density is as we defined before, density is equal to the number of organisms in a specific area. Whereas dispersion, as I was editing this podcast to upload to the Blackboard, I noticed I misspelled dispersion. I don't have my cameras here, so I can't fix it, but this is supposed to be D-I-S-P-E-R-S-I-O-N, dispersion. Sorry about that. Is how that density is dispersed. Which are those three patterns of distribution. All right, let's move to the last question that a population ecologist might answer, and that is, how does population size change over time? So some of the factors that can change a population, so if you look at a population of, let's do dolphins. What's going to impact the size of this population? Well, several things could. What could add to the population, so we'll put a plus here, would be births. How many new dolphins are born in this population? And answering these questions, you'd have to address questions of reproduction, what influences the reproduction of this dolphin population. We also have cases of immigration. That could add to this dolphin population. Now, what decreases from this population? So a minus would be deaths. And the opposite of immigration would be emigration. That is when individuals leave this population. So individual dolphins leaving this pod and moving to a different population would be an example. All right, let's write this simple equation then for change in population size. So a change in population size is equal to the number of births plus the number of immigrants subtracted from the number of deaths plus the number of immigrants. So for instance, if we knew in a particular population that there were, well, let's take our dolphin population. Let's say there were in a starting population of 30 dolphins. Over a period of 10 years, say, there were 10 births. Plus one immigrant. They allowed one to join their pod. And we subtract that from the number of deaths. And let's say over this 10-year period of time, we had 13 dolphins die. And we had 2 leave the population. So we add these up. 10 plus 1 is 11. Subtract that from 13 plus 2, 15. So our change in population size here is -4. So there's been something impacting this population to cause it to decrease in size. We know it's 26. We know it's mainly to a high percentage of deaths in this population. Plus, for some reason, a couple of them have left. So the population ecologists might now try to decide how this change has occurred. Is this something that we saw in the previous 10 years? Can we make any kind of predictions about what this population of dolphins will be in the next 10 years? Is there anything we can do about it? Is there a human impact that's causing this decrease? Lots of kinds of questions we could ask from these data. All right, the last thing we need to talk about for this podcast are the survivorship curves. Okay, so let's talk about these life histories. And let's draw this diagram here. These are life history curves. On the vertical axis, we put the number of survivors. On the vertical axis, we put the number of survivors. On the horizontal axis, we put percent of maximum life. So let's put 100% here, we'll put 50% here, and 0% here. And we'll put 1,000 here, and this is sort of a log scale, and 0 down here. The numbers don't matter too much in this example here. So we have 3 types of survivorship curves. I'll use the same colors your book uses in case you use it as a reference. Type 1 would look something like this, where most of the individuals who are born most survive to at least 50% of the maximum life, and then somewhere after the 50% mark is hit, they gradually decline until they get pretty close to that 100% maximum life, and then they begin to die off. A great example of this, no bias included, are humans. You and I represent a type 1 survivorship curve. Most humans will survive long enough to reach 50% of maximum life, and then they will steadily decline. I should have probably drawn this line where it kind of shows a steady decrease, because we know not everybody in a type 1 survivorship curve survives until they begin to drop. So some key features of a type 1 survivorship curve would be that few progeny are produced. Few progeny. They care for them well. Some animals will produce a child, and then that progeny is off on their own within the next day. And we'll also see a lower, as is indicated by the curve, a lower death rate. In addition to humans, many large mammals fit this category. Okay, let's erase this information here. I'm going to keep the curve there just for comparison. So let me draw type 3 next, because it's probably a nice opposite of what a type 1 is. So we can see a very sharp decline in population from the moment of birth till the moment of maximum life. So we have a high death rate. In this case, usually these organisms produce lots of progeny, so a high number of progeny, very little parental care. So we would see as examples of this many kinds of fishes, insects, lots of invertebrates would fall into this category. Many kinds of plants would fall into this category as well. One key thing, though, to look at is we see those that do survive actually will reach the maximum life and do quite well. But there's this huge drop-off at the very beginning. And let's draw our last example. And this is a type 2. Type 2, as the line would suggest, is an intermediate between the two. They have a constant death rate, unlike the type 3, where we have a very sharp death rates, and then those who survive, the death rate decreases. Type 1, very low death rate in the beginning, but then a very dramatic death rate towards the end. So a constant death rate from 0% life to 100% life. Some of examples of this would be ground squirrels, rodents, other rodents, some plants like your annual plants, lizards, all right, that ends this podcast. This for objectives 1 and 2. There will be probably just one more podcast to cover objectives 3, 4, and 5. Let us know if you have any questions, and we'll see you in class. Bye.